Welcome to Grief, Grace, and Gratitude. I'm your host, Rhonda Kemp. On this podcast, we will be sharing our grief journeys with one another. Each one of our guests will talk about the loved ones they've lost to overdose, as well as the impact of substance use disorder. As you listen, you could write down and share with us a question or discussion topic that you would like to see us include in our future episodes. Just as it says in the book of Psalms, chapter 34, verse 18, "The Lord is near to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." My hope is to bring comfort to those who are crushed in spirit. As we talk about the shame of addiction and devastation of loss, we want you to learn how to survive and even thrive while navigating through the difficulty of grief. Tonight we have a special guest, Marguerite Woodall. Marguerite's the author of an incredible book, The Light of Navigation, and she is a speaker for different settings. I got to meet Marguerite at a Hope After Loss retreat, I think last October, and I was just blown away by the relationship she has with the Lord, how she has used her loss of her son and in serving the Lord and being there for so many other people. So I'm really excited to have Marguerite on the podcast tonight. And just tell us a little bit about yourself and your son, Randall.
I'm an average everyday person. I've been a florist most of my life. I recently fully retired. I now focus pretty much on the book I've written and speaking events. My son died of a drug overdose in 2016. He got a hold of some product that had some what they call phenylfentanyl, and he passed. I live here in Oklahoma and pursuing writing another book as well.
And what would you, if you could go back, I mean, sometimes it's hard to go back to those first few months after October 2016, losing your son. How old was Randall when he passed?
My son was 32. And it was 2 years old, yes.
And what, if you could go back and just kind of highlight what was that like it compared to your life now, of course. What were
My
those
son,
years?
what- I'm sorry. My son was my only child. His father had passed in an accident on the job back in 1988. So I ended up burying my son next to my husband up in Florida. That's where my son had decided to stay when I moved here to Oklahoma. I have to say, in retrospect, looking back, that mm, I was in a state of shock for at least 3 years. I also experienced what some call PTSD symptoms, different events, like trying to visit my son's grave at one point, and I had um, a total memory loss of the entire day. Mm, And it wasn't until about 3 years later that I started to actually, I believe, come out of the total shock, and it became a reality for me. Um, Many nights, the first year or so, was going to bed and literally asking God to let me lay my head on his chest to hear his heartbeat, because you honestly don't feel like you're going to make it a lot of times.
Yeah. I remember that feeling too, and a lot of fear comes into that because, most of the time we're in control of ourselves as adults, and when something tragic and horrific happens to our lives and losing a child especially, you're just full of anxiety, fear, doubt. And like you said, if you can lay your head on chest of Jesus. There's no better place to be. It's kind of your only choice. My description was I would crawl up in the lap of Jesus and just sit there. And it's the same because I read something not too long ago. The deeper that sorrow carves into your being, the more joy you can contain. And in those first years, you can never imagine having joy. That was just like you said, you're just trying to get your mind around what's happened to your son and how you're going to go forward. So it takes a lot of time, and thank goodness we do come through it. And our life is different; it won't ever be the same.
It's true.
But uh, there is life after loss. Thank goodness. We're
Well,
not proof.
yeah, it is.
And where you are now, how would you describe?
It's really, really strange. In this season of my life, my relationship with God has deepened far more than I ever could have imagined. And it's because of the brokenness of heart from the death of my son. And I have, from that relationship, a joy like you're speaking of that is just exponentially growing. And I feel like I'm in a season of my life that is just so rich and so full, despite the circumstances. And I wouldn't trade that for anything. I hate that this happened and then this is the end result because of that. But you know what? God takes our brokenness and he does turn it into a lot of joy and a lot of growth if we'll let him do that. Yeah,
And only God could do that. We
absolutely.
could we could never walk this journey without that part of it. When people try to do it in their own strength, we fail in miserably. I know I've taken it upon myself to fix my grief, and that's just out of desperation, because you really feel like I can't wake up and do this every single day. Like it's year one, it's year two, it's year three, and I know year four is probably gonna hurt just as bad. So you get it in your mind, you're gonna have to do something. And thank goodness we have the Lord to go back and lean on when we think we can take the reins. Because everything I tried didn't work. To say it gently. Um, so you have a takeaway from loss and suffering, and besides your relationship with the Lord, how have your other relationships changed? If you could think on that.
Um, well, I immediately think of my church body and where I attend church, but also in my daily interaction with people, if it's in the grocery store or wherever I'm at, um, that breaking or brokenness that occurred through the death of my son literally opened me up to relationships. I was a very cold, closed person most of my life. Relationships were very difficult for me. I had a lot of walls, and this brought down all my walls. And now I think nothing of walking up to somebody. How are you doing? And starting a conversation, which is the exact opposite of who I used to be. There's compassion there that wasn't there before. I'm just more open now to God using me to reach out to people and genuinely loving people. I read about the love of God in the Word for decades, and I've only had an intellectual assent about what the love of God is. Now I'm actually experiencing it, and it's pretty awesome.
That
So
I guess when the Bible says be grateful for your trials, that's what that means.
and that flies in the face of what we understand in our humanity and our fallenness. It's the exact opposite of how we have a tendency to think. Suffering is a friend. And if you tell most people that, they'll tell you you're crazy. But it's the truth. It
Because we
develops.
wouldn't have signed up. We wouldn't have signed up for this.
Yeah. No. Uh,
No. And we both know our children were believers, and we
Absolutely.
have rest in where they are, and we're going to see them again. So that completes that picture of uh, our children are safe. They're with the Lord. And he had a purpose and a plan, I believe, with my daughter to keep her from getting into more pain and more suffering and more uh, the life of addiction. It's just horrific for the user. Um, so before your relationship or before your son passed away, I'm sorry. Were you speaking? Were you writing? Were you actively?
Uh, I started my book before my son passed. I have had it on the inside of me for years and years and years, a knowing really deeply buried that I would be writing a book, a desire to write a book. I just didn't know if it was ever going to happen, or how it was going to happen. I had just started putting together short stories, um, when about a year before, and then my son's death hit, and then COVID on top of that, right after that. So my son's passing actually, fueled even more writing to complete the book. And I was able to incorporate into that book a lot of encounters with God that I had when my son died. So um, there was a lot involved.
And we've talked about how God has spoken to you in some of our other talks. We call them God winks. There's other descriptions for them, but did you get your first God wink quickly after Randall passed, or do you remember?
We got one even before we left the house to fly to Florida to bury him. He was living in the state of Florida, or that's where I had to bury him, next to his dad. And I was, of course, here in Oklahoma, but that first encounter with God occurred even before my sister and I could fly out to Florida to make the funeral arrangements. She came to me and she said, Marguerite, God is impressing upon me to start a GoFundMe for his burial expenses. And I looked at her and I said, well, whatever. Because, on the inside, I'm thinking, does God use GoFundMe? Well, I don't know. And I said, go ahead. And I kind of blew her off in all honesty. We had $4,000 by the time we boarded the plane the next day.
From strangers.
Yes, one of the largest donation was from a stranger. And there's a whole other story to that one. And I needed about $10,000 to pay for a basic funeral. I didn't want to put it on a charge card and be looking at that payment every month for 3 or 4 years. And God just stepped in. And by the time we got there, and on the very day that we had to pay the funeral itself, the expenses, the money was all there. It was all there.
Wow. God.
And those God encounters continued for that entire week on a daily basis and for several years afterwards, 2 or 3 years at least. So
Did you had the faith, of course, you've been a believer for many years, but seeing those type of things really strengthens your faith. And in your speaking when you engagements, how do you prepare for those? Do you just I know you spend time with God every day in a quiet time.
it's sitting down on the devotional times during in the mornings. I don't always make it every morning, but a few days ahead before I speak, or even a couple of weeks, I'll begin to ask God, "What do you want me to talk about?" Um, I could talk about anything if I wanted to, but it's important to me that I speak what He wants me to say. So I'll just listen. And sometimes it takes several mornings of just listening, but then there'll be an impression about a certain subject or something that comes to mind and it keeps coming to mind. And then you have that, I know that I know that I know this is what I need to share.
So
And
so
it's
we really
honestly,
just have to having that special time carved out to to just be with him. I think that's what I've learned
Right.
in building my faith is just stop what you're doing and give him your undivided attention. And we're always in prayer. I think we're always in a state of prayer, but it brings you joy when you know you're communicating with God.
S- My son.
A whole it's a whole different level of joy, and we're not all I'm speaking for myself, I'm not always in that capacity that I wanna be. I have days where I stumble, but knowing you can't do it without him, I think, is where the change is, and we didn't get to talk very much about Randall when I asked you first, to introduce yourself. What was he like?
He was a very good looking kid. He was a lady killer. Um, he was very charismatic. His father was very charismatic too. Made friends wherever he went. Um, he's the person that liked to joke around all over the place. He was known for his compassion and for standing up for the underdog, especially his close friends and in high school as well. Um, he was just a light when he walked into a room. When people would get together, he was the life that came into the room all the time. And yeah, it impacted a lot of people when he passed for that reason.
I hear that so often with the description of our kids that have passed
Yeah.
young, that they were special people, and it's like they lived a lot of life in 29 to 30, 31
Oh, he,
time. They didn't leave, without affecting a lot of their
yes.
friends and family.
Yeah.
And, so if you're talking to someone now that's grieving or you feel like you're open to that, what would you say is the one thing that really helped? If you could say one thing in the depths of the pain that you don't think you're gonna make it to the next day, what one thing would you do?
For me, it was my relationship with Christ, with God. I mean, that's the anchor. I just, as you say, crawled up into his lap relationally, and I stayed there for quite some time. I made it a point to just pour my heart out to God every time I came to the table with my cup of coffee and sat down to talk to him. Every morning if I could, and in the evening too. And you know, something else that really helped a great deal was journaling and putting a lot of my thoughts and my feelings and my anguish and my grief on paper. Writing letters to my loved ones and writing letters to my son to express my heart. And, you know, when our kids pass or anyone that passes that we love, we have a lot of regrets. They they seem to knock at the door immediately. And then, of course, the devil will make sure that they knock at the door. And getting all of that on paper, some people call it vomit on paper, um, it helps you unload all of those feelings and get them out into the open. And there's something about bringing all of that out into the open in front of God when you're talking to Him that dispels any of the darkness that tries to shake you down. Is that what?
Sharing it.
Yeah,
Sharing it even with yourself as you're writing.
exactly.
It's the exercise. Yeah.
It's huge, huge.
It sounds like you've done some really good grief work and not maybe even knowing how to do it. I mean, I think we just have to trust that God's going to take care of it. And so what are some of the things God's shown you? Because I know when you spoke at the Hope After Loss uh, retreat, you had some very specific stories about things God has shown you that it fascinated me. If you can share one or two of those.
Well, I'll tell you what, that's a broad subject for me. Can you narrow it down a little bit?
Okay. Well, I'm trying to remember what was the
I know that what I spoke about was is God good? And where's God when we lose something we love deeply? And will God give us answers when we have loss like that? And God did give me answers. And he wanted me to tell other people he does want to give answers about our losses. And what looks like devastation, because God has the long term view in mind, is not in the long term. It's just not from an eternal perspective. And I know that's a really broad subject for
You got it.
it
I
really
know.
is.
Yeah. And helping other people. I think that's one thing that's key for my recovery, if you want to call it recovery, is just knowing that you can relate to other people's pain and being available for that.
It opens the door in relationships to other people that wouldn't otherwise be there because they could legitimately say, "You don't know what I'm going through." I do. And my biggest cause and purpose in writing the book and getting to know people and speaking is to get people to connect with God. He wants to connect with them in a much deeper way when they go through these things. And he wants them to come out the other side of those events with an incredible connection to him that's unbreakable and matures people. And in this day and time, with all the chaos and the storms people are going through, we need that. We need that
I
anchor.
need that.
Because
So if you were going to describe your book, what would be the best description of it?
just that, to get people to see how God moves in other people's lives, that he wants to do it in their life, that he is moving in their life, but they don't understand it or see it, that he wants to reach out and make that connection with them and walk them through the other side of whatever they're going through. And to come out the other side with an incredible relationship that's unshakable.
Mhm.
He's the God of all seasons. He's the God of our past, our present, and he's the God of our future too. At one point in a dream years ago, he showed me where he was in my past and showed me a lot of the good things I didn't remember or could not see in my past. And it radically changed a great deal in me at that time.
So dreams are a good way for God to communicate.
He will do that way. Absolutely. He will.
And if you could say, I'm trying to get my thoughts here about your book. Have you had people remark on what it's done for them? Do you
I have. I have.
see back?
And it's having an effect that I didn't expect. Young woman I spoke with recently made it a point to let me know that when she started reading the book and got partway through it, the Lord pointed out to her some unforgiveness that she had in her life that she thought she had taken care of. And in the moments when she had the Lord pointed out to her, he literally stepped into her moments. They call it kairos. He stepped into her moments and showed her where the unforgiveness was, and he led her out of it. And she came out of that totally forgiving whoever had abused her. And I'm sitting there, okay, that's awesome, but and it's just, and then I've had another individual tell me that they started to recognize in their life from reading it where God had been working in their life and they hadn't even noticed, hadn't seen it.
Wow.
We look for the big, awesome lightning bolt strikes, God's movement, but he's so loving and so tender and pays attention to detail. It's the little things that he does that are just spectacular. We always look for the obvious, and that's not always the
Yeah.
case. So,
Wow. I love that. It's nice to hear when people really get what you're trying to put across in your book, and then even more, a big
Exactly.
bonus on top of that. And, do you have any similar stories of when you're speaking to a group? Do people come and tell you that this has made them see things differently because of your presence there?
I know there's impact. I've had people tell me that. The impact is of a nature that it's a lot to take in because the book is very raw. It's very open about what it looks like, along with the short stories, what it looks like to grieve as a Christian and as a mother, as a parent. And it's a lot to take in. And you can tell there's been impact. Mm. They're just, it's taking time to process it. And usually they'll come back around and tell me something like, oh, wow, I'm beginning to see where God is operating and I didn't even see it. He really does care. He didn't forget me. That book is his story. It's not mine. It's his story in mine. And it's all meant to point to him and who he is and his goodness right in the middle of the worst adversity you can go through. Um, One of the most profound things I ever heard God speak to me was when my son was being bullied as a little boy in school. And they come home and they're crying and they're upset, and you just want to go do something about it. So I took a walk one day and I said, Lord, I said, I don't want my son to be bullied like I was in school. What do I do? And I've heard him just as plain as day. He said, Marguerite, adversity breeds champ. And I went, okay, I don't like that much, but that's your age.
He is right. The
So
Yeah. So it's okay to have to go through some difficult things as a
it is.
child.
It is. It's painful.
And when we're grieving, I've heard so many times people say they're angry at God.
But
Did you ever experience any of that anger?
you know, I have had anger at God, yes. Not about the death of my son. I did not. Now, I've been angry at him about other things that happened over the years, kind of a cumulative buildup. And God has been helping me confront and face that. I think it's kind of something almost everybody has on one level or another. When you're trying to live this life in such a fallen world, get mad about things that happen.
Right.
Uh,
Right.
but no, I did not. Not where my son is concerned. Now, I have run into people who do, and it's totally understandable. And I know God certainly doesn't condemn them for it. It's part of the walk, I'm sure, for many. But I know it's one thing that he wants to address and to bring resolution to as well. Because the enemy wants us to see God as anything but good. And if he can get you to stay in that anger and stew in it for a long time, you can actually change the direction and the course of your life. Uh, and that's not good.
That's so good. And I know that with me, I didn't really have anger towards God at, for a long time. I think at like year 9, it's been 10 years for me
Mhm.
since I lost my daughter. And wasn't really angry at God. I was just like angry at the whole picture, the whole, why did my daughter have to be an addict? And I had asked myself that many times, but it was strange that I felt that so late in the grief journey, but it didn't last long. It's just waves of things come and go when you're grieving. And I'm just grateful that I had her at all. That gratitude has helped me to just be thankful that she was in my life, even for a short time. And when in your book, do you talk about the addiction of your son's journey, or is it more just about reaching out to God? That's okay.
My apologies.
That's okay.
Um, there's some aspects of it I'm probably going to write about in the second book I started. I don't go into much detail about it, really. Not in this first book. Just the journey through the funeral and the God encounters that have occurred over the years since the funeral, the week of the services. You find out a lot of things afterwards from friends, his friends, that I wish I had known ahead of time. I can't speak for anybody else, but his friends knew about his addiction, how heavy it was. Of course, I lived out of state and did not understand. He was able to cover it over and hide it quite well when he lives in another state. I knew that my son had a problem with drinking, and I had been praying for him. I was hoping that perhaps he would have, mature beyond that. But as the story started to come to the surface, he was in the throes of alcoholism as well, and not just the drug addictions. And I guess what if I could be mad about anything, none of his friends said anything to me. I wish someone had told me, kept me in the loop, something, but that just didn't happen. Yeah.
And in that world of addiction, a lot of people don't share. They don't, they don't get involved with it. It's an ugly, messy thing, and
Yeah.
we all hope that they'll just stop. We,
Yeah.
especially when they're
Mhm.
young, we just think they're young and they're gonna
And they're
get
going to
through
outgrow
this.
it.
Yeah, that's us moms. We hope it's just a stage, and sometimes it is, but yeah.
True.
Well, the fentanyl that actually killed him, was that something new on the scene at that time? Because I know we deal with fentanyl
It's,
now in a very different way.
I don't much other information on it to speak of. Not an expert in that arena, but it's what they termed in the autopsy report as a phenylfentanyl, which is a fentanyl knockoff. It's cheaper for drug dealers to make than regular fentanyl. That was my understanding. And it was laced in some cocaine, I believe, that he took.
Mhm. Well, the journey is a long one for parents and other loved ones, but we talk to a lot of parents, and I'm just glad God has his arms around us and our children, because when you pray for them and you don't think the prayers are answered, they are answered. Our prayers are answered, I believe. And for Lacey, I kept saying she's going to be set free from this. I know she's going to be set free from this, and she was. She,
Absolutely. The best
her
healing
struggle
possible.
ended. Yep, yep. And I did have dreams too, and I had words from God the day she died. Be in agreement with me was his word to me. And it just meant, it was a difference in, I think my grief journey totally changed when he gave me that word. Because how can you not be in agreement with the creator of the world and each one of us? I just don't know how you could not be in agreement with him, because he knows best. And to take the time and just speak to you and come to you in dreams is a remarkable thing, actually. So what brings you joy now when you're living your daily life? What can you
The writing,
any
the writing, I just, the podcasting that I'm learning to do. My greatest joy is the speaking events and sharing my heart and sharing who God is with other people. That is amazing, and I love it very much.
and you're so good at it.
Well, God is good to me, and just to have the privilege of being able to share a small little part of what I've experienced is just That's just it's beyond words for me. I'm sorry. It really is. But I enjoy it
More
immensely.
th it's more than you imagined you would
Yeah,
have,
it is
is what I'm
for sure.
hearing. And, you're do you have a YouTube channel now?
I do. I do. It's called The Light of Navigation. And if you type in The Light of Navigation and then Marguerite Woodall, it will come up. Otherwise, what you get is a lot of channels about boat navigation. Light.
The word navigation.
Yeah, it's a very
Yeah,
broad word.
The Light of Navigation. Did that title just come to you all at once, or did you have to
Well,
work that?
the day my son died, I was in church. As I was driving to church, I had a vision, and I saw a very stormy sea, horrific storm. I saw a small red white striped lighthouse on a black rock in a bay area, and the waves were crashing against that lighthouse. And the Lord started doing a download for me as I got off the exit to get to my church. And He said, Marguerite, He said, Jesus Christ is your light of navigation. He said, there's many storms out there that people are trying to get through and they lose their focus on me. And my son is the light of navigation. And he was using that lighthouse as a reference point. And I was stunned. It was an entire message. I don't remember all the words in front of me at the moment, but I wrote it down in the book. That's the opening story. Got to church. I shared it with people there I felt led to, and the pastor allowed me to get up and share that vision about the storms that are coming and to stay focused on Christ, that He's our lighthouse. I got home after church, and later that afternoon, policeman came to my door to tell me my son had passed the same day. My son passed in the very moments that I was sharing the vision. So the vision wasn't just for everyone in the congregation, it was for me too. That's the opening story in the book, and that's why I titled it The Light of Navigation. That's why I started this ministry to glorify God and to point people to Him because He is the truest light of navigation.
Oh,
That's the
great.
story behind that.
Wow. I'm glad I asked. That's amazing.
What's the truth?
And he knew you needed that to get through that time.
Yes. Yeah. He was shoring me up like you wouldn't believe and bracing me so I could get through that. So,
Absolutely. And having to travel to get to your son is a whole nother level of
yeah.
unbelief. We do operate on a just, I don't, like you said, it's like a numbness, basically.
Show pilot.
Autopilot.
Mm,
Yeah. And
me too.
I see people, go ahead.
There have been, don't get me wrong, there have been times where, you feel like you're being stretched like a rubber band and you're going to break. And it's in those moments that you have to really fall back on Christ. But I've had those moments where I didn't think I was going to make it, and I had to cry out to God to get me through. And He met me every time.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah. He won't leave you stranded. Well, you've been a light to a lot of people, and I know everyone that I know that meets you is changed because of your ministry. You're doing a
thank you.
big work for God, and
Hear it.
I want people that are not in a good community to share, be able to hear your story, and that's what this podcast is about, just to open up the conversation about how do we get through such difficult, impossible things. Because the biggest fear I ever had was losing a child. Um, I can't think of anything that could be more devastating than to raise a child and love them in the way that you can't love anything else, and then to have to say goodbye to them because we're left here without them. And reminders come every day. I just celebrated my birthday the other day, and I laughed at some of the things that I could remember. Lacey's gifts and cards were always funny. I laugh thinking about what they would have been like now. But I had so many of those 30 years with her that my memories are just, they're sweet. And yeah.
Awesome.
So, what else would you like to talk about if you were open to is anything laid upon your heart to
So,
share?
what came to my mind as you were talking earlier was people wonder, why did God allow my child's death? And what about the other people? We're still out there doing drugs like crazy, and nothing, they make it. They have these close calls, and they're still here. Why did and then when my son was relatively young and his addiction wasn't years and years long, it suddenly passed. And then someone down the road, their children has been in addiction for decades, and it's like God bails them out over and over and over again. And I've just come to that place where I realized that it's just that, it's common sense. If I'm going to make sense here, I stood on a grocery store aisle one day stocking groceries when I was still working, getting ready to set the can on the shelf, and I heard a voice come up behind me and tell me, "You abandoned your son when you moved to Oklahoma." I moved to Oklahoma in 2004. My son would not move with me. He was of age. I couldn't force him to move. He wanted to stay with his grandparents and his friends, and that's fine. When that voice spoke that to me that day, and this was 2 years after my son's passing, it literally paralyzed me. I stood in front of the shelf and I couldn't physically move. It so stunned me. It was an audible voice. 60 seconds later, another voice came up behind it and I could hear it on the aisle. And the voice said, "You didn't abandon your son. He abandoned me. And I took him home before he did it again." And immediately the paralysis just left me like that. I stood and I had an answer as to why God did not step in and intervene when my son overdosed accidentally. It just changed everything. And I began to understand what he had done was a loving thing by allowing it. He didn't cause my son's death. My son made poor choices. He made the worst choice possible. But God didn't cause that, but he allowed him to pass. He could have stepped in and he could have intervened. And that was just plain as the nose on your face when he made that statement to me. Evidently, down the road, my son was going to be turning away from God in some sort of apostasy. Who knows? God allowed his passing before that could happen. And my son made comments just before his death about he was at a place where he was getting ready to repent and walk away from the addictions and come back to God and be where he needed to be.
Wow.
So that opened up a whole new view. Hello. Why a lot of kids overdose many, many, many times and they still keep going, and others, the first or second time, they're gone. God is there in every single circumstance, regardless. I just saw God as being more in charge than I ever dreamed.
Right.
Because we have a tendency to blame him for these things, but we don't have an eternal view, and he does.
That's so true.
It's rather radical, but that's what I have experienced. And
I think you're exactly right. We can't see the big picture. And he's merciful to say this is the perfect time for
it's
him
that
to come home.
And, we think of the love of God as something that rescues us all the time. Sometimes his love will not rescue for a reason, for an eternal purpose and reason down the road. Mm. In our humanity, we don't see love that way because God's love is not born of the human mind. It's not. Mhm. This is a different kind of love that will take someone home or allow someone to come home before you want them to go home. But there's
Mhm.
something down the road that was far more devastating, and you want them out of the way.
My friend called me the day Lacey died and told me that exact thing. She said,
Really,
"Yeah, this has happened to Lacey because God is keeping her from something worse,
I believe.
saving her from something worse." Yeah. And that really did change my thought because I wanted to blame myself. I wanted to blame the drug dealer. I wanted to blame, you want to blame somebody, but if he's rescuing your child, then
As well,
it's
let it
such
go.
an easier, such an easier path to accept. And there's so many people hurting right now that don't have the answers that you have and haven't had those interactions with God. So I'm hoping if you're listening to this, you have a way to get down on your knees. I had to get low on the ground. When I was grieving, I was on the floor, at least on my knees. I never stood up. I was in front of a window or I was outside on my deck. I was down as low as I could go and just begging God to help. And he does rescue us. So that's wonderful. I'm glad you added that. And I knew you had something. You always have something.
But there's some things that I would love to share, but I don't know sometimes if people are ready to hear it. And that's one of those. So I kind of step myself out there.
That's okay though. I know if God tells you it's real, then we have faith that it is. It's not your imagination. So thank you for being brave.
My
Yeah.
pleasure.
And the dreams that I've had, I've shared with people that Lacey actually came back from heaven and was incredibly peaceful and beautiful and in a fresh sense of seeing her face, and I knew she'd come from heaven. So, in the dream, you realize they're coming to visit you. It's not like you're remembering them being somewhere with you. And I remember what she was wearing. It happened 3 or 4 times. Once when she was a baby, she came back as like a 10-month-old baby. And she had this little outfit on, like a smocking. I remember the outfit, but I hadn't thought of this for,
Mhm.
you know, 30 years. And she had her leg crossed up. Her bottom of one foot would always be on the inside of the other thigh when she would sit up at that age. And she had a tear duct that was blocked at that age. And she always had a little tear in her eye because the blockage just kept her from it was just her, exactly her at that precious age. And she was just speaking to me, that you're going to be fine, mom. You're going to be okay. It's amazing, and when you tell people those stories, you kind of feel funny talking about it because you think it's your imagination, but there's a difference. It's a gift from God, I believe. So,
I've had I've had several encounters. Very brief. It's only occurred once or twice after they passed. Anything beyond that, scripturally, is questionable for me, in my opinion. Mm, You'll get people throwing that out there. Oh, you don't want to communicate with the dead. No, this is not what this is. Communication with the dead is asking their advice and direction. These are encounters I know people have had with loved ones who've passed. One or two encounters in dreams, like you're speaking of, or otherwise, where they just want to let their loved one know, I'm okay. I'm with Christ. You're going to be fine. And I've had that happen several times over the years. And it did with my mother. I did with my husband as well, too.
Uh-huh.
So I know what you're talking about. It's very real.
Yeah, it's definitely, and it's very calming, and it's like you reach a different pinnacle at that point
Yeah.
because you do know that they're safe and they're sound and they're happy and they're free. And once it came up in a rainbow, a tiny rainbow showed up in a cloud, and I heard her say, "I'm good, Mom." That was the day after we buried her. And she always said, "I'm good." That was the way she would say it. And I'm not saying it's her speaking, it was just that reassurance that
Yeah.
I could feel safe that she was in
Yeah.
God's hands. And
Yeah.
so he does huge, huge, huge things for us.
It is.
And I'm just I'm glad to be a born again believer and get to share all of these things
Me too.
with him. And if you were, what would my last question be? Because we have to wrap up. Uh, on your journey now, I know you put your faith in God and your writing and your speaking engagements. And if you were telling somebody with a loved one that's still using an addiction, would you have any advice for them?
For starters, to get hooked up with a really good organization like Hope is Alive, having that support is huge. Mm. And it helps you to learn how to walk the journey without becoming entangled in theirs and being dragged around by the addiction in their lives. And you have a great support group, um, meeting a lot of really great people that are going through the same thing, good principles, mm, to learn by and to live by, and to learn not to contribute to the addiction yourself without meaning to enable. That's the first thing that comes to my mind. Staying next to God, staying tight with God, developing relationship there. A side note, one thing I see in groups like Hope is Alive and Hope After Loss and other support groups, Grief Share, what develops there is community. And the church as a whole, I think, has lost sight of what community is. And that really struck me when I saw how these support groups operate. Again, sticking close to God, making it a point to develop deep relationship with the living God. It's important. That is your foundation. Staying connected with other people.
Because Satan loves to get us alone and isolated.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and it's easy to do when you're suffering and in pain.
Very
You
much so.
don't feel like you fit in. Even in church, sometimes you don't feel like you fit in because your life isn't real happy at that time. And a lot of people want your best face, and you just don't have it. So
True.
yeah, Hope is Alive is a good program, a great program for sober living, for the addict, and finding hope for the families. So I'm just grateful that you took a little time with us, and uh, we'll put the link to your book here that people can look it up. Journaling is important too, so we'll put some links to maybe some journals that you've used along the way. So
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to share as well.
thank you, Marguerite. It's been great to talk to you. Till next time,
Bye bye.
bye bye. Thank you so much for joining us today and for being a part of the Grief, Grace, and Gratitude community. Remember, God has not forgotten you, your dreams, or your broken heart. Join us for our next episode, available wherever you listen to podcasts. To help us reach more people, please like, share, subscribe, leave a review, and follow us on social media. Those links are in the show notes.
What will you trust God with today?